Hey everybody, my name is LaPrecious and welcome to my channel. Let's talk with LaPrecious. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about part one of the Janet Jackson documentary that came on last night on Lifetime TV. So I was very excited that they were doing a documentary on Janet Jackson because you really don't see a lot of icons like her, especially black icons like her, get celebrated and get nominated for, a lot of awards or even get that type of recognition to have a documentary done on you. Now, of course, there are biopics, but when there's a documentary done that really studies you, studies your person, it studies your craft, it studies your talent, that really says a lot about who you are and your legacy and your career. So when the first part of the documentary got started last night, it started off really good. And one thing that I really liked about the documentary was that it was so natural. Like I remember a lot of the docu shows that used to come on a long time ago, especially in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, like on MTV's True Life, where people would break out, a regular camera and they would document, how they're getting plastic surgery or the type of lifestyle they're living, things of that nature. It looked more so like a vlog as opposed to a documentary that was done on TV. Or better yet, it pretty much looked like the documentaries or the docu-series that they do on like ETV when they want to go behind the scenes of a celebrity's career, of a celebrity's tour, and so on and so forth. So I really felt like the production of this documentary was done the right way. Now, I did like the beginning of the documentary because I felt like it was well thought out. It was pretty much, Janet Jackson talking like in front of a black screen and she just gave the intro and whatnot. And then, it opened up where she was in the car and they were going through the city and she saw a mural of like the Jackson Five, who were like her brothers. And she was like, oh, I like how everybody's looking up and Mike's looking at you. So he was always so nosy and everything. And she said she just liked the symbolism of it and she thought it was really sweet. And then she kind of, broke down crying because when it comes to the Jackson family, they were like the most iconic black family in music history. And one thing that I really liked about the Jacksons were that they were not only just seen as a black musical act, they were seen as like just a musical act. Because that was one of the things that I noticed, especially with Janet and her like romantic relationships, how back then in the 80s, you would think of, especially with black people, because you really didn't see a lot of like interracial dating on TV as much, or even in music videos, or even in public at all. And Janet and Michael, as well as their other siblings, just dated interracially so openly. And it seems like nobody really had an issue with it. They really didn't get any flack for it. But I did like how, she talked about her upbringing in Gary, Indiana, and they went back to their family house and she saw like the area that she used to sleep on as a child, and she went to the bedroom that her brothers used to sleep in. So she was pretty much going down memory lane. Now, I'm not here to be mean or to attack Janet Jackson or anything like that, but I just really wish she wouldn't have got as much plastic surgery done on her face. Now, plastic surgery with the Jackson family has been one of the most talked about things since Michael, went from being a Jackson 5 Michael to the bad Michael, how black people used to say when Michael Jackson was black before he turned white. And my thing is with the Jacksons and all the surgery and the skin bleaching and everything, I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but I just remember from past interviews and past talks, they said that their dad will always make them feel bad about their looks, about their appearances. Michael will always, get teased about his nose and whatnot. But I just personally feel like the Jacksons, they went through what a lot of black people went through back then. When it came to black people, historically, we weren't seen as the most attractive people. Now, in my opinion, the Jacksons, they were very pretty, especially Latoya. Latoya, when she was a teenager up until like her early 20s, she was like very pretty. And, she was naturally light. Like, she was one of the only siblings, I believe, that was naturally light skinned. Long, bouncy hair. sweet look. And, of course, as it was the 70s when they took a lot of these family pictures and started their careers, they dressed, like really groovy and everything. So, they kept up with the times, they kept up with the style, the hair, and everything. And they were just a beautiful family. But I feel like a lot of the surgeries that was done, I mean, it's what a lot of black people went through at the time. You weren't pretty if you were black, especially if you had a big nose, big lips, and everything, and, you know, natural hair and whatnot. It just wasn't seen as pretty or as attractive. Now, back then on TV, black people, we had to be out and be ourselves naturally with the froze and the light makeup and the natural look and whatnot. But back then, you just had to be skinny. And so, they fit the image and whatnot. But I mean, of course, through time and just through culture as well, black people were not instilled with self love and self beauty and whatnot. And I feel like that's what happened with the Jackson family. And I just feel like with Janet, she was already a pretty woman. I felt like when her first album came out before the Control album did, she was her prettiest. When she came out at 18, 19 years old, that was the prettiest she ever was. And I really wish she would have kept her face and would have stayed like just in that pretty mode. So, moving along from that, she pretty much talked about like the Jackson family and how they were raised and how they were brought up. And then she talked about the relationship that she had with her father. Now, we all know Joe Jackson. Everybody talks about how he was such a mean dad, how he was, abusive and like overbearing and whatnot towards them. The only credit that I can give him was that he made his kids known. They became the Jacksons. Even though he may have been mean, he may have been strict, he may have beat them, but I feel like if there wasn't a Joe Jackson, there would be no Michael or no Janet. And I don't know what it is, but you just see that with a lot of celebrity powerhouse families or powerhouse backgrounds now. With Whitney Houston, there wasn't a abusive background with her. She grew up in, upstate United States, and her mom was a gospel singer, so she had that church choir background, and that's where her voice came from. And then you had people like Dionne Ward, Diana Ross, all of these people came up in the choir era. But when you get to like the 80s, these people pretty much had a rougher background per se. Now with the DeBarges, and they play a part in Janet Jackson's stories as well, since her and James DeBarge were married when she was, 18 years old and he was 21. And so it just seems like with the 80s style powerhouses and whatnot, they kind of had a stricter background with the DeBarges. Their abuse is nothing compared to what the Jacksons went through. The Jacksons, they just got bad whoopings. But when it came to the DeBarges, their daddy beat, raped, molested, did everything he could to them and their mom. And then even with Selena, and when I say Selena, I'm not talking about Selena Gomez, but Selena Quintanilla Perez, her father was very strict because when they came up in the 80s, it was Selena and Los Dinos, and then, the 90s, it just became Selena. Their dad pretty much had a very strict hold on them. And it's kind of ironic how the DeBarges, the DeBarges, they came from a religious background as well. Hey, Valerie S. And the Jacksons, they were Jehovah's Witnesses. And even with Selena and her family, they were Jehovah's Witnesses. So it's kind of funny how a lot of these powerhouses, they both had these strict religious, backgrounds and, the stern father figures and whatnot, but they made them household names. So yeah, they may have been, strict and may have been harsh, but it paid off a lot in the end. So, Janet pretty much talked about her dad and how her mom was worked at Sears and how her dad was a steelman. And oh, you read that Joe Jackson molested one of the daughters. Now, I never have heard of that. I do know from being little, seeing the Jackson 5 miniseries they used to play all the time on VH1, which is a 5 hour long movie. Even though it's a miniseries, it's actually divided into different episodes. But back then, they didn't play it like that. Just like with the Temptations, the Temptations was a miniseries, but they played it like a movie. But that Jacksons, the miniseries that the American Dream, that's what it's called, the Jacksons, the American Dream. That thing was 5 hours long, but it was good though. And a lot of us that grew up, watching the Jacksons or whatever, that's how we learned their story. And so Janet, she pretty much talked about her father, how she wished that her father would have been a father to her instead of a manager, because she felt like her dad was pretty much, the stern, you got to get up, you got to sing, you got to practice, you got to do what you got to do. And she pretty much felt like she would have experienced fatherhood with him, excuse me, fatherhood with him, as opposed to experiencing, the stern manager, the stern, dictator and whatnot. She felt like she just really didn't get to experience that daughter father relationship that she wished she would have had, or like other kids had. And, Janet, she pretty much respected her father. Janet, she didn't show any type of disdain about her father and how he was in the documentary. And, Tito, her brother, was pretty much saying that she was one of the only ones that would stand up to Joe, and said that Joe, instead of him fighting, Janet back or trying to tear her down or knock her down, he admired her and respected her for that. And that was the thing that I've always liked about Janet, was that even though she was really sweet and pretty and whatnot, you could tell she was stern. And I like how Janet came from that era where you were famous, you were well known, and people talked about you and spread rumors and whatnot, but you weren't messy. It's like you let the mess be the mess and you just teetered on it and whatnot, but you never addressed anything, and you just kept it going with the music. And I mean, and they really knew, even they knew that their music was what made them, but they also knew that the gossip and the tabloids and whatnot made them as well, but they knew how to make it all work for them. And that's what I liked about Janet. Now, moving along from the childhood and whatnot, Janet, I felt like she had such a natural, like, upbringing, like how her career just flowed and how her talents just flowed, and how her father just really opened up the gates and whatnot for her, because she talked about how the first time she was in Las Vegas was when she performed, and that's how her career really got started. And then she talked about how she would sneak off with her brothers and they would go to like the different strip shows or like the cabaret shows and just see all types of stuff. And I mean, it's Vegas, so you pretty much see everything. And she said at the time that Vegas was not really family friendly. Now, one thing I will say to Vegas back then as opposed to now, when I went to Las Vegas, I can say it is more family friendly. Yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they were Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jacksons, they were Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, one thing I could say about Las Vegas back then as opposed to now, when I lived in Las Vegas, it was family oriented more so than it probably was back then, because in Las Vegas you can go to a lot of places with your grandma, with your great grandparents, as probably opposed to what you could back then. Because I mean, Las Vegas was known as Sin City. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But now Las Vegas has changed a lot of that, and they still have strip clubs and sex shows and all of that, but they're much more hidden and prettied up and not as raw as they probably were back then. So yeah, Janet, she talked about how her career pretty much blossomed when she was in Las Vegas, and her father was the one that told her to play Penny in Good Times, who we all know is a little girl who was the mother of a, not mother, but she played Walona's, eventually adopted daughter. But Janet's whole startup on the Good Time show as Penny was, she was being abused. She was a sweet little girl that had a crush on JJ, and JJ would bring her over to the house and she would play and whatnot. And Walona, she took a liking to her and everything. But then, she started showing up with bruises and burns on her backs and so on and so forth. So Penny was pretty much like, a foster child in a way that was getting abused by her mom, so on and so forth. And then Walona, pretty much adopted her and took her in. And that's where you saw like the change from it being about the Evans family in the beginning in Good Times. And when James died, all the kids grew up, and then Walona, she adopted, Penny, and then Thelma got married. And that's when we pretty much saw the change and the maturing of the Evans family. And I felt like Penny, she was a good fit, because Penny is still well loved and well liked from the Good Times era. From the Good Times era. Yeah, Penny was cute. Janet Jackson, she was cute. She was always cute and pretty back then. And so she pretty much talked about how her career pretty much blossomed since then. And then she pretty much spoke about like music and how she pretty much had to be a regular kid at that, because she showed a clip of an interview that she did, and this person interviewed her saying, "So are you going to start your music career? You're going to go to college?" She was like, "Well, I kind of have to think about both. I'm going to go to school, but I'm also going to focus on my career as well." And that's the thing that I love. And I feel like even well known artists today, like Megan Thee Stallion and Sweetie, they still, I like how they give you that good balance, how you could be this sexy innovative rock star or this sexy innovative rapper, but still have substance, where you're educated, you got a house, you got a car, you make your own money, and you're pretty much a powerhouse, or you're pretty much an independent woman on your own. And so that's pretty much what Janet was doing back then. And then, we see her come up with, the first album, and she was talking about how with the first album cover, she didn't really have as much say or control over the kind of picture that was chosen. And then after that, we get into her marriage with James DeBarge. Now, Janet and James DeBarge being married, I feel like that will always be one of the most talked about marriages, relationship in pop culture history. Every time they talk about black music in the 80s, James and Janet and Michael, it's gonna always come up. And I mean, of course it's gonna come up because, Janet, she came from the Jacksons, and James, he came from the DeBarges. And at the time in the 80s, even though the Jackson vibe was a thing of the 70s, Janet still had that powerhouse name. She was a Jackson, so she already had that, and then she had her own career blossoming. And then James, he was in the DeBarge family, but he came from, Switch, because before the DeBarges came out in the 80s, their older brother Bobby was in the 70s group called Switch, and they came out with well loved popular songs like "I'll Call Your Name" and "There'll Never Be." So he had that, Motown house, that big Motown pop backing, as well as like the Jacksons did. So do you think they had a secret love child? I'm going to get into that because they did talk about that during the documentary. So when we start talking about like the marriage and whatnot, we all know that James and Janet, they eloped. There was nowhere in the world that that Janet's daddy was going to be okay with them getting married, with them starting out, in love and in a new relationship, and her career is popping and the DeBarges are just popping off. They knew that it wasn't going to be something that everybody was going to accept. Now, I will give a take on both sides of the story. Now, speaking from Janet's side of the story, Janet, she was this sweet American pie, pop star that was just now blossoming. James, on the other hand, he came from the well known, humble beginning, rough and tough, the Barge family that was from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so, Switch, they pretty much had their ordeal and whatever. And plus, they also had the bubbling drug abuse and the childhood abuse and all of that. Their upbringing was very horrible, and they had that backing as well. Now James, on his side, he wouldn't have got as much flack from his parents or from his family at that for being married. I mean, the DeBarges, it was 10 of them, and a lot of them that were in the family. Let's see, Bobby didn't really have kids just yet. Bunny, I don't think she had kids until like maybe the late 80s, early 90s. And El DeBarge, he started having kids when he was 12 or 13 years old. So, yeah, they kind of had that background. So, I don't think they really would have cared that he and, Janet would have gotten married. So, they went ahead and eloped and whatnot. Now, the background story was that Janet said that when she got married to James, that he left her alone for 3 hours in a hotel room. And my thing is with that, I felt like that's when Janet really started to see his drug abuse. Now, I read an article of the things that she was saying and talking about. I got into the documentary, but since Janet has that snow bunny like kind of voice, you kind of have to like strain or kind of listen really close in order to understand what she's saying. So I had to read the article to pretty much get the full story of what she said about James. So I feel like when she was left alone in that hotel for 3 hours, that's when she started to see James's drug abuse. Now, to those of you who don't know about the DeBarge family, the DeBarge family was pretty much a family of 10. They were a big family just like the Jacksons were. Now, their parents were not nothing compared to the Jacksons' parents, like Joe and Kathy. Now, James' parents consist of Edeline and what was their dad's name? I can't really think of their dad's name right now, but their mom's name was Edeline, and I forgot what their dad's name was. But the Jacksons pretty much grew up in, Jehovah's Witness, strict. You have to do everything that we tell you to do, be obedient, go to Saturday services, so on and so forth. But we're gonna make you into something. When it came to the DeBarge family, they were abused tremendously morning, noon, and night. Their father was a very mean man. He abused the mom. He raped and molested and physically abused Bobby. Did the same thing to Bunny. Now, I don't think Elle or Randy got abused as much, and James was seen as the favorite. He was also abused and molested by Bobby as well. And Tommy ended up experiencing the same type of abuse from Bobby that his father had, put on Bobby. So they were just pretty much a hurting family. It's like when you look at the life of the DeBarges, they sung to get away from their pain. But the Jacksons, they sung because it was a talent and it was going to make them famous. So there's like the similarities and the contrasts right there. Now, Janet did say experiencing, James's drug that there were times where he would go missing, probably on a bench somewhere, and she would have to go look for him at like 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. She said there was a time where they were arguing over drugs being spilled on the floor, and she was, pretty much fighting so he wouldn't get the drugs and whatnot for her to get him up off the floor and so on and so forth. And it seems like since Janet had never really been exposed to a person dealing with drugs like that, or a person that was addicted like that, she probably felt like, this is somebody who grew up different. This is somebody who's hurting. I mean to be, the faithful wife, because they were married for a year. So of course, a whole lot could happen in a year. She probably grew to love him and to be there for him and whatnot. But I think what happened now, when you look at the unsung of the barge, the only response that James gave was that her father had a lot to do with it. But seeing it from Janet's perspective, I think Janet had did everything that she could and she just couldn't do anything else. And she felt like, I have to save me, I have to save my career. I'm young, I don't need to be bogged down in a drug abuse relationship like this. So let me just, get an annulment and let it go. Now, the whole secret child thing, from the DeBarge side of the family, Bunny DeBarge has always been adamant that Janet and James had a baby. And the other family members, they kind of trailed behind it as well. And Bunny went as far as going on the radio saying that there was a secret child between Janet and James. And then I do remember that Elle was getting upset and getting mad at Bunny. Then Bunny had to come and apologize, saying that, I was the one that kept up that rumor and I shouldn't have. So the Barges, they were adamant that there was a child. But on Janet's side, I felt like when they talked about it, they said that when the rumor came out, they said that Janet's niece, which was really one of her brother's daughters, was her child that she gave to her brother to raise. Because, I mean, back in the day, especially in the 80s and 70s and even further back, having kids out of wedlock and having children young, that wasn't something that was celebrated or done out in the open like it is now. Cardi B and the City Girls and a lot of other women, they've made it very popular to, have a career and have a man and have a child and do it all in the same breath and do it out in the open. Back then, it was more modest, and plus TV, music, career, everything, it was still church bound. And so back then, when women had babies and whatnot, especially they were 18, 19, 16, 17, their parents would make them give their children up. The parents would adopt them as a sibling, or they would go down south to an Aunt Esther or Aunt B and give the child to this mysterious aunt or uncle to raise, or they would pretty much just abort the child, which was a taboo thing too, but people did it back then. They just didn't talk about it. Now, Reby, their other sister, was talking about it. They said the tabloids at the time were saying that Janet gave the baby to me and I was raising a child. And Janet was saying, well, how can I have a child and not let James see the child? What mother keeps their child away from the father? Why would I do that? Now, I'm going to tell y'all what I think. Janet and Reby, they never did say whether there was a child or not. They danced around it and floated around it. I believe that James and Janet did have a baby, but the baby either was aborted or the baby died in a miscarriage. Cause I just feel like it was such a hot and cold answer. Yes, you were pregnant. Cause I mean that's been one of the most anticipated answers in like the history of Janet Jackson and the Bard and James the Bard. It's like, was there ever a secret child? They even had a woman coming out a long time ago that said she was a secret child of Janet and James. I personally believe that Janet and James did have a baby, but the baby either died in a miscarriage or Janet decided to abort the child because she felt like she was too young to have a baby and she felt like James just wasn't in the right place mentally or physically to raise a child. She felt like they were too young to have children back then. So that's my take on as far as them having a secret child. I heard that too. I think there was a child, but they didn't want to mess up Janet's image. Yeah, that's what I felt too. I did, and I mean, it may seem wrong that she aborted the baby, and it's sad if the baby died in a miscarriage. But at the same token, you can't really blame them because, like I said, in the '80s and in the '70s, image was a very big thing, especially for black artists. Now, black artists, I feel like they take this for granted nowadays, especially because back then, if you were black, like in the days of Janet, Whitney Houston, Anita Baker, TLC, image was everything because back then, as blacks, we knew that non black people pretty much saw us as whores, prostitutes, people that couldn't really do much with ourselves, wasn't about nothing, and we was going to mess something up. So we did everything that we could to beat the stereotype. Now I feel like black artists, they're being everything, including the stereotype, which isn't good, but it's unfortunate how the stereotypical stuff is making money than the good stuff is. So that's just that. But moving along from Janet and James's marriage and elopement and the whole cloud of the secret child, she pretty much talked about how she moved on from that era and how she became like her own woman and her own being. And then we get into the marriage between her and Renee. Now Renee, I don't know if a lot of you caught this, but do y'all remember the Poetic Justice movie where Lucky played the mailman with Joe Torre, and then there was this Mexican guy that they were always messing with and whatnot in the mailroom. That was actually Janet Jackson's husband at the time. Because I actually had to remember when I was looking at that movie a long time ago, I'm like, wait a minute, that was Janet Jackson's husband. So yeah, the Mexican guy that Lucky and Joe Torre's character were joking around with, picking at in the mailroom in the scene of Poetic Justice, that was Janet Jackson's husband at the time. So they pretty much talked about their marriage and whatnot. I felt like Janet and Renee, they had a really spiritual, intuitive like kind of marriage. It's like they just got each other. Because Janet and Renee, they even showed like unseen footage of them. Because Renee, I believe he was a director, choreographer. He was into the industry as well. And I felt like when it came to Janet's control era, and that's when she got into her like militant role with the all black and the hat with the chains and stuff. Like that was where we knew Janet as like Janet. And so with her being with Renee, I felt like he pretty much molded her image because they showed how during the makeup of Control, how he was telling her how to dance, how to do different poses, how to protect her image, and just how to really shape herself. And I felt like Janet, she was in like the learning process, because here's this man, who's different and he's pretty much, showing me all these different things and he's really helping me out. Now, Janet and Renee, they were together for about 10 years. And when I say together, they were married. So I believe they got married in 1991 and got divorced in 1999 or 2000. So yeah, they were married for a very long time. And even the iconic she did now after Control, we pretty much saw like the '80s Janet, and then we get into the red velvet or like the red rope era of Janet. That was my favorite era of Janet. When Janet had like the red hair and the piercings and she started wearing more like seductive clothes and everything. That's my Janet. I love the red velvet tightrope, Janet. The control one, yeah, that was fun for me. That's more my mom's time than mine. But the red velvet Janet, that's me. So he was with her from the time of control to the red velvet era, poetic justice, and all of that. So Renee and Janet, they were together through like Janet's upbringing and her maturation and her changes and whatnot and all of that. So it seems like they had a really beautiful marriage. And a lot of you guys may know about that controversial, iconic magazine cover that she did where she was completely topless and it was a guy like hugging her breast and everything. They say that was him, Renee, hugging her like that. So, and I also feel like at this time, that's where Janet became like more rugged, more of on the edge, and she just tried to do like different things. And the edginess for her, it really did help. Now, when you compare her career to Michael's, he had that same maturation too. Because with Michael Jackson, you had the Off the Wall album. I wanna rock with you all night, rock you in the day sunlight. And when the groove getting gone, yeah, you had that Michael, and then you had like the Wiz Michael. You pretty much had the '70s go-go Michael, but in the '80s you had the Bad album, and then with Janet you had Control. So it's like there were a lot of similarities between them, even as siblings in their careers and in their life as well. Because Michael started to become more edgier. He had the black hair, he had the sharper look. He was wearing like the white tees and the leather pants and the shoes. And he was still moonwalking, but it had an edgier feel to it. The dance moves were a lot sharper. There was a bigger upgrade to the music videos. And the same thing with Janet as well. Now, back then, the reason why their music videos were so iconic was because they put a lot of money into those videos. Now, when Janet and Michael put out music videos, their videos were like movies. And a lot of those music videos cost about a good $2 to $3 million to make them that good. So Janet and Michael, the thing that I love about them was not only did they hone in on their craft and they knew how to change up their image and their look to make them more appealing and more edgier, but they were very smart about how they conveyed their music and the type of image that they put out. And there was a lot of creativity and a lot of artistry. Because the thing I love about Janet, and this was way before cultural appropriation became a thing, because Janet, she really did touch on a lot of different futuristic and zodiac, planet twilight and multicultural aspects in her music videos, because she would do things where it would look like she was out of space. Then she would do videos where it looked like she was in ancient Egypt or India or Malaysia, would be dancing on airplane wings and pyramids and stuff. And then Michael, with the Remember the Time video, everybody was, ancient Egyptians dancing and whatnot. And then, with Janet in the '90s, she became more R&B with the Red Velvet era. She had like the natural, red curls, and then she had like the leather tight outfits. And I think that's when she got like the nipple piercings and the vagina and the vagina piercings as well. And I'm not saying that to be nasty or anything like that. But at the time, that's how Janet was. Janet pushed the envelope and she became more sexual and more enticing. And it really helped her image at the time. But with last night's documentary, I don't think it touched on the '90s era just yet, because last night was more so about, her upbringing, her being a kid, and her pretty much being married and like developing into womanhood and adulthood and whatnot. But the thing that I find about that era of music, especially with Janet and a lot of other icons, how packaged she was, like with her upbringing and how she had all these people looking out for her and welcoming her and opening up doors for her and everything. But even though she had a lot of things opened up to her and handed to her, she knew how to build up and how to hone in on those things. So that's pretty much all I remember from the Janet Jackson documentary part one, and that's pretty much my take on it. But before I go, let me know in the chat what you guys thought of the documentary or the questions that you have, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, since nobody has any other questions to ask me, thank you all for watching this video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment in the comment section, and have a good day.